While that's taking place, I do want to commend those in the audience that have chosen to wear a mask. No one would believe it, but the media is now acknowledging that we are in a summer wave of COVID with various competing strains, some of which we don't know how serious they are. And so we intend to defend the health of our members and supporters, to prevent the spread of COVID to the clinically vulnerable, and also to the more general spread in the population, which is leading to a really catastrophic development of long COVID with its malignant and long-term symptoms. So if anyone who I've convinced wants a mask, they're there to be had. We have taken additional protections. We have far UV lights, which are the most advanced technology for killing viruses in the air, and HEPA filters as well. Now, this meeting has an ambitious aim, not to merely argue for a vote for the Socialist Equality Party in Holborn and St Pancras, as important as that is. No, we are here to convince you to commit yourselves to the building of a mass socialist anti-war movement, to place the struggle against war at the centre of efforts to systematically mobilise the working class against capitalism and its parties, and here in Britain to break once and for all with the rotten, right-wing, pro-business, anti-working class, genocide-enabling warmongers of the Labour Party. In the words of our election manifesto, which I'm sure everyone has seen, Keir Starmer and other Labour leaders are hated for backing mass murder and ethnic cleansing in Gaza based on their sickening invocation of Israel's right to self-defence. But Starmer's party of Zionism is also the party of NATO, and what is being concealed from the public gaze is the active and advanced preparation for a Labour government to drag Britain into a war that would see the atrocities of Gaza multiplied 1,000-fold. Now, to build an alternative means one thing above all: to recognise that all the major problems confronting the working class, including opposing austerity, defending democratic rights, and the central issue of political leadership and the fight against war, can only be fought out on an international level. So we will urge you this afternoon to join the Socialist Equality Party, but doing so means joining a world movement, the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Party of Socialist Revolution, founded by Leon Trotsky. Now, many of our party's principal leaders are represented on this panel, and they will argue at greater length than I have available for our analysis of the desperate crisis of world capitalism and the socialist solution that we propose. But I want to say something about our speakers. The true measure of a party, its character, can only be understood by carefully examining its programme and the history of struggles it has led. But those it attracts on that basis personify the character of the party, and leadership, contrary to some, matters a very great deal. It's decisive. So to today's platform. Darren Paxton, furthest from myself, is the SEP candidate for Inverness, Skye and West Rossshire. Darren's a young man, but he's already demonstrated that he's a political fighter and a genuine voice representing all that is best in today's generation of the working class, an unswerving commitment to the principles of socialism, to the class struggle, and above all to internationalism. Like all our comrades in Inverness, he was won to socialism through a conscious break with the snake oil of Scottish nationalism. He's living proof of how Marxist analysis, articulated by the World Socialist website, can cut through all the political confusion generated by the ruling class and its political servants to cut a path to the generation that must make the social revolution. Alex Lantier is the National Secretary of the Parti de l'Égalité Socialiste. Any reader of the World Socialist website will recognise Alex's byline as a mark of penetrating analysis of world political events, but in particular of the escalating crisis of French imperialism, the mass opposition to Emmanuel Macron, the president of the rich, that pitched millions into struggles such as the Yellow Vests and the mass protests in 2023 against his pension cuts that have ended in the debacle suffered by his party in the European elections, mostly at the hands of Le Pen's far-right National Rally. Now, as many here will know, Macron's response was to call another snap general election, the first round of which takes place today. We're therefore doubly pleased that Alex is here to speak to us. Christoph van Dreyer is the National Secretary of the Socialistische Gleichheitspartei of Germany and also a prominent writer for the World Socialist website. The SGP's lead candidate in this year's European elections, Christoph brings to this meeting a rich understanding of German history, especially regarding his major role in opposing efforts of prominent professors such as Jörg Babarowski to relativize the crimes of the Third Reich. This informed the writing of his book, Why Are They Back? Historical Falsification, Political Conspiracy, and the Return of Fascism in Germany. A familiarity with this work is essential in the struggles against the emergence of a fascist danger, rooted in the re-eruption of German imperialism's once suppressed predatory global ambitions, and the class war which is being waged against the working class. Now, Joseph Kishore has travelled a very great distance to address this meeting and does so at a crucial point in US and therefore world history. The United States, despite its historic decline, remains the cockpit of the imperialist world system, the centre of intrigues against the workers and oppressed masses of the world, the power behind the Zionist regime in Israel, and the leader of the NATO alliance of imperialist powers. Joseph Kishore represents that other and much less understood force that exists in the United States, which he once called the sleeping giant of world politics, the American working class. Joe was radicalized as a young student, joining the party in 1999 during the NATO war against Serbia, and within just 9 years, he was chosen as National Secretary of the SEP, a measure of the high esteem in which he is held. And our final speaker this afternoon is my comrade and friend, Tom Scripps, the SEP Assistant National Secretary and our candidate for Holborn and St Pancras. I hope that Tom is familiar to everyone here today. He has taken on the immense political task of breaking the conspiracy of silence over NATO's war aims in the Ukraine, of placing Gaza in its proper context, and advocating for a socialist alternative to Keir Starmer's party of genocide and war. And we're all immensely proud of how he has led this election campaign. Now, incidentally, Tom first applied to join our party when he was 16, and it was a serious application letter. I said at the time, who the hell is this? And where did he come from? Well, 12 years later, now I know. Now, our first speaker will be Darren. He will not be speaking on Inverness. I want to draw attention to two paragraphs which are placed right at the beginning of our election manifesto. The manifesto said, amid mounting opposition to the war and resistance to the draft, the Zelensky government has arrested our comrade, the Ukrainian socialist Bogdan on fraudulent charges of serving the interests of Russia. Bogdan is an intransigent opponent of the capitalist Putin regime and its invasion of Ukraine, fighting for the unity of Ukrainian and Russian workers and youth against war. We then make this point. His fate mirrors that of Julian Assange, imprisoned for 14 years by the UK and facing extradition to the US and a possible 175-year sentence for exposing war crimes. Now, I'm sure we all know that Assange has secured his freedom, but I will also suggest, without doing forensic investigation, that this was the only election manifesto that took up the fight for Assange's freedom. No one else will have done so. And today, Darren will speak on the relationship, the lessons to be drawn from the struggle for Assange's freedom, for our own struggle for the freedom of Comrade Bogdan. Comrade Darren.
Hi everyone. On Monday morning, following a plea deal reached by his lawyers with the US Department of Justice, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange finally left Belmarsh prison in London. He was flown to the US federal court in Saipan in West Pacific Ocean, where he pled guilty to a single count of violating the US Espionage Act. Late Wednesday night, Assange arrived in Canberra, Australia, a free man. He raised his fist in the air and waved to the crowd. It was a gesture of solidarity with millions across the globe, conveying his unshakable conviction in truth and the duty to speak it. When the US federal judge in Saipan asked Assange if he understood the crime he was pleading to, he replied, "Working as a journalist. I encouraged my source to provide information that was said to be classified in order to publish that information. I believe that the First Amendment protected that activity." He added, "I believe the American Espionage Act and the First Amendment are in contradiction with each other." The Espionage Act, introduced by Woodrow Wilson's Democratic Party in 1917 during the First World War, denies First Amendment rights and criminalises free speech and the freedom of the press. Among the classified information received by WikiLeaks was a video footage supplied by US Army Private Chelsea Manning showing war crimes by the US military in Iraq. The collateral murder video exposed the brutality of US Apache helicopter gunmen as they mowed down 18 Iraqis in cold blood. "Look at those dead bastards," the pilot says. His co-pilot replies, "Nice." Collateral Murder was one of the many publications by WikiLeaks, including the Afghan War Diaries, Iraq War Logs, and US diplomatic cables that shaped mass consciousness and politics, galvanizing anti-war sentiment. In retribution for his courageous disclosures, Assange was subjected to a ruthless vendetta by US imperialism and its allies. Nearly 15 years incarcerated in Britain, first under house arrest and then illegally detained inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and then 5 years in His Majesty's prison, Belmarsh. Lawfare by Britain's judiciary, which was ready to extradite him even in the face of the CIA plans to kidnap and assassinate Assange. His incarceration was made possible by a filthy lineup of liberal media outlets led by The Guardian and backed politically by the pseudo-left. Groups like the Socialist Worker Party and Counterfire, who use gender politics, espoused by affluent middle class, to legitimise the sexual assault allegations manufactured by the Swedish state in collusion with the CIA. A key role was played by Jeremy Corbyn, who, as a leader of the Labour Party, remained silent, suppressing a potential mass movement in Assange's defence and blocking any challenge to the Blairites. I am proud to represent a party that never wavered in its defence of Assange. I am one of the thousands of young people who worldwide learned about Assange's case through the World Socialist website. All of us in the party's branch in Inverness, all in our early 20s, have been educated politically in the fight for Assange's freedom. He was released because the Biden administration feared his extradition to the US, and it would inflame mass popular opposition to the Gaza genocide amid a civil war election between the fascist Donald Trump and Genocide Joe, and under conditions where the US and NATO powers are preparing a massive military escalation and a war with Russia. The World Socialist website wrote on Wednesday, Assange will forever be seen by future generations as a fighter for freedom of speech and democratic rights. This election rally sends its heartfelt greetings to Julian Assange and salutes his courageous struggle. But even though Assange is free, the global capitalist offensive against democratic rights is accelerating. We have termed this a war election. We are standing to politically educate and mobilise the working class and young people against the preparations by the major powers for war. This is the significance of the Gaza genocide, the mass murder of more than 45,000 defenceless civilians, mostly women and children, the barbaric crimes comparable to that of the Nazis. Gaza is just one front in the developing global war led by US imperialism and the NATO powers targeting Iran, Russia, and ultimately China. By backing Netanyahu, Britain, the US, France, and Germany are making clear there is no line they will not cross in the pursuit of their predatory interests, and that includes cluster bombing hospitals and targeted assassinations of 147 Palestinian journalists. The genocide in Gaza has provoked a global outpouring of opposition led by young people. This means that the imperialist genocide is being accompanied by an unprecedented war on democratic rights. Protest is being criminalised. Opposition to Zionism and genocide is branded anti-Semitism. Anti-war journalists are detained at UK airports and interrogated under counter-terrorism laws. The sharpest expression of the crackdown on democratic rights in the service of this imperialist war is in Ukraine. A regime led by Zelensky, resting on the descendants of the fascist organisation of Ukrainian nationalists, accomplices to the Nazi Holocaust, is targeting left-wing, socialist and anti-fascist organisations. On April 25th, Ukraine's SBU secret police, in collusion with the Biden administration, imprisoned our comrade, 25-year-old Bogdan Syretuk. On June 3rd, the Zelensky regime then banned the World Socialist website across the entire country. Bogdan, a leader of the young guard of Bolshevik Leninists, was arrested and imprisoned for opposing the war and advocating, in articles and speeches, for the socialist unity of the Ukrainian and Russian workers. He faces life in prison. The indictment against Bogdan accused him of high treason, and they alleged that Bogdan had engaged in preparations for publications commissioned by representatives of a Russian propaganda and information agency, the World Socialist website. The WSWS is denounced as an instrument of an active information war against Ukraine being waged by Russia. These absurd accusations are refuted by the historical record. As David North wrote on May 17th, our intransigent opposition to the Putin regime, which emerged as a consequence of the Stalinist bureaucracy's final betrayal of socialism and the restoration of capitalism across the former USSR, is a fundamental political fact that is substantiated not only in written text numbering in the hundreds, but also in the exhaustively documented activity of the Trotskyist movement spanning decades. NATO's proxy war against Russia lends no legitimacy to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. We reject his regime's claim that the invasion is justified on grounds of national defence. The defeat of imperialism and its overthrow is possible only through the revolutionary struggle of the international working class. The targeting of Bogdan and the World Socialist website is instructive. The SBU writes, since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the World Socialist website has regularly published articles in various languages aimed at discrediting Ukraine and representatives of governments around the world for assisting Ukraine in its fight against the aggressor state. After more than 2 years of a NATO-instigated war that has left hundreds of thousands dead, opposition among Ukrainian workers and youth is growing. These are conditions in which the principles of socialist internationalism will again take hold, not just in Ukraine, but in Britain, France, Germany, the US, and worldwide. On June 13th, sections of the ICFI held a global picket outside Ukrainian embassies demanding the release of Bogdan. We put the Ukrainian government and its NATO backers on notice that our international campaign will escalate. This campaign must spearhead a fight against NATO preparations for war. The snap general election has been called to set the stage for the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. on March 9th to 11th to prepare a massive escalation of war against Russia. The danger of nuclear war has never been greater. I appeal to young people. The most important decision you face today is to join and build the SEP, the British section of the International Committee of the Fourth International, and take up the struggle for socialism. Thank you.
I've already introduced Alex. We're really pleased he's here. It's a testimony to the internationalist foundations of our party that he would even contemplate being here on such a day. But we conceive of our struggle as the fight for the unity of the working class, and that means educating the working class on the fundamental political struggles that are unfolding on the world arena. With that, I'd like to introduce Alex Lantier.
Comrades, it's a pleasure and an honor to bring the fraternal greetings of the Parti de l'Égalité Socialiste of France to this international election meeting in Britain. Comrades have already mentioned, the previous speakers, that today voters are going to the polls in France in the first round of snap elections in which the neo-fascist National Rally is in striking distance of a parliamentary majority. This could mark the first time since the fall of the Nazi collaborationist Vichy regime during World War II that the far right could form a government in France. And of course, a few days later, British voters will go to the polls in snap elections in which the Labour Party, if one believes the polls, is set to crush the ruling Conservatives. Now, despite the differences in these projected outcomes, these twin snap elections pose, in the final analysis, the same issues to the working class. They flow from the massive escalation of war with Russia that is being prepared, as well as very well advanced plans for class war against workers at home. The decisive question facing workers, not only in Britain, not only in France, but around the world, is how to fight capitalism's plunge into world war and fascistic reaction. In both Britain and France, it's the war calendar that's driving the election calendar and not the other way around. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and French President Emmanuel Macron did not decide suddenly to call elections in order to deal a crushing defeat to their own parties. They fixed the July 4th British and July 7th French snap elections dates to prepare for the July 9th NATO War Summit in Washington, slated to discuss direct NATO intervention against Russia. Despite the debacle of the NATO-backed Ukrainian regime's counteroffensive last year, the NATO powers do not intend to tolerate defeat. The purpose of these snap elections is to carry out a right-wing restructuring of official politics in order to push through this war escalation. Now, in February, Macron launched the overwhelmingly unpopular call to send French troops to Ukraine. Polls found that 68% of Frenchmen, then 80% of Germans, and a few weeks later, 90% of Poles opposed this modest proposal for global war. More recently, a Eurasia Group poll found that 94% of Americans and 88% of Western Europeans support a negotiated peace settlement between Russia and Ukraine. But the policy of NATO, in response, has been to recklessly give the Ukrainian regime long-range missiles to hit civilian targets in Russia and risk a catastrophic military escalation. These NATO governments rule against the people. Last year, to fund a massive military spending increase, Macron in France ran through an overwhelmingly unpopular pension cut without even the pretense of a parliamentary vote. He sent riot police to assault mass protests and strikes against the cuts and relied on the union bureaucracies to call off protests once his cuts were validated by the courts. Now, he intends to use the same methods to try to tip France, Europe, and the world into a global war. Now, at the center of the discussions in the ruling class over these snap elections are plans for an essentially fascistic regime. As it comes ever closer to power, France's neo-fascist RN is shifting to the right, visibly in line with the broader fascistic restructuring of politics that the ruling class is trying to carry out in the snap elections. The RN is signaling that it will not oppose war with Russia. RN candidate Jordan Bardella called the RN's previous overtures to Putin an error. And RN leader Marine Le Pen, who has been waging a fascistic campaign denouncing people with dual nationality, has now said that one of her principal targets will be the danger to France posed by people who have both French and Russian citizenship. At the same time, the RN is signaling to the banks that it will scrap its empty pledges to defend French workers against Macron's austerity agenda. An anonymous top member of Le Pen's staff told French state television at the end of this week that if elected, the RN will name a banker as finance minister. The RN is considering reintegrating into its ranks Marion Maréchal, a prominent neo-fascist who denounces strikes as hijackings and calls for a ban on strike activity. The threat of war and of fascistic dictatorship that these comments point to does not, however, come only from the RN. Macron has said that France is on the verge of civil war and has floated the possibility of suspending parliamentary democracy. Government insiders have told the media that Macron may invoke Article 16 of the French Constitution, which grants the French president unspecified emergency powers of indefinite duration, unchecked by either the parliament or the courts, and effectively makes the French president an unelected permanent dictator if it is invoked. Now, the article states that this article can be invoked if the institutions of the republic, the nation's independence, its territorial integrity, or the respect of its international engagements are gravely threatened and the normal functioning of constitutional authorities is interrupted. Now, under the present conditions, Macron's talk of invoking this article is itself a flagrantly illegal bid for dictatorship. France has not been invaded, its territorial integrity is not threatened, and has not been targeted by a far-right coup like the sort that Donald Trump launched in the United States 3 years ago. Macron is not invoking this article to protect democracy, but because the financial aristocracy is demanding a war and must therefore turn against even the trappings of parliamentary democratic procedure. Now, what is driving these plans for war escalation are NATO's stated plans for a strategic defeat of Russia and a desperate policy of global war launched by the imperialist powers. They aim to reverse the decades-long deterioration of their economic position by wars of neo-colonial plunder. NATO war planners aim to force regime change in Moscow, carve up Russia, loot its oil and mineral wealth, and ultimately use it as a base for wars against the Middle East and China. The type of reactionary implications this has, one sees in the fact that the NATO powers are now backing openly a genocide in Gaza. Now, workers cannot fight capitalism's plunge into war and fascistic reaction at the ballot box. The way forward is the broadest international mobilization of the working class in a movement against imperialist war based on a Trotskyist perspective for socialist revolution. Workers cannot pressure capitalist politicians to find a democratic policy on the national soil, because the capitalist class does not ultimately want democracy. It wants dictatorship and war. This underlies the bankruptcy of the electoral strategy proposed by the new Popular Front coalition led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the French ally of Podemos in Spain, the Democratic Socialists of America, and Jeremy Corbyn here in Britain. The new Popular Front in France is a pro-war trap for the working class. It must be stressed, first of all, that despite its name, it is not at all like the Popular Front that lasted between 1934 and 1938, and that's well known in French history. It brought together the bourgeois liberal radical party with mass workers' parties. The SFIO, the French section of the Workers' International, a social democratic party, and the Stalinist Communist Party. Trotsky warned against the counter-revolutionary role played by this alliance, which tied workers to bourgeois liberalism. It subordinated masses of workers in the SFIO, or in the PC, to corrupt cliques in the radical parties led by political operatives like Édouard Herriot or Édouard Daladier. After selling out the 1936 French general strike, blocking his struggle for power by the working class and for socialist revolution, the Popular Front collapsed. It paved the way for the ruling elite's ignominious collaboration with Nazism 4 years later, in 1940. Trotskyists could, however, at that time, for a time, enter into the SFIO, and despite the Social Democratic Party leadership's bitter hostility to Trotskyism, work among the SFIO rank and file. The workers' parties in the Popular Front carried out policies and activities that are unthinkable for a Mélenchon or for a Corbyn. They formed the always ready to serve workers' militia, the famous PPS, to fight attacks on the labor movement by fascist groups, and they advanced calls for significant social reforms, including the 8-hour day and paid holidays that are well known in the French and international working class. But the new Popular Front is something very different. It brings together the PS, a bourgeois party of French imperialism since its foundation in 1971, with various parties of the affluent middle class. These include the PCF bureaucracy, which has completely lost the working class base it once had over the decades since the Stalinist dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. There's also the Pabloite New Anti-Capitalist Party, the leading representative of Pabloite anti-Trotskyism in France, and finally, Mélenchon's own France Unbowed Party. The new Popular Front program, if one reads it, does not propose a single significant major social reform. What it supports is Macron's war and the French police state. Its election program calls for, quote, the delivery of appropriate weapons and, quote, for sending peacekeepers to Ukraine. It proposes to strengthen the French military police and the intelligence services, and it demands billions of euros in state subsidies to associations promoting gender politics and for the trade union bureaucracy. Its policy towards Russia was laid out by a leading member of Mélenchon's party, François Ruffin. Ruffin said that towards Russia, our policy should start very simply by building our war industry. Europe must regain its sovereignty in arms, cannon, warplanes, the full gamut of weapons, materials, and technology. And it should no longer depend on the Americans. And it must give itself the means to do so. For this war effort, we must watch carefully over the unity of the nation. Now, these comments not only reveal why LFI and the trade union bureaucracy agreed to the sellout of the struggle against the pension cuts. They themselves see the diversion of massive financial resources away from the working class and from retirees and towards the army as a major military priority, and as a way to ensure their privileges and the privileges of French and NATO imperialism within the world economy. But I also want to raise one question in terms of the lessons of history. The strongest warnings must be made about populists who preach national unity when in the middle of the nation there is emerging a far-right movement that demands the bloody suppression of the working class and that calls for war. During World War II, these types of arguments ultimately carried figures like Henri Dumont in Belgium or Marcel Déat in France into national unity with the far right, that is to say, or at least how it was called in an earlier period, collaboration with the Nazis. And as capitalism plunges into a new world war, one thing can be said for certain: figures like Ruffin can only produce disasters for the working class. Now, the rise of the far right is not the result of mass support for genocide and war. Indeed, the principal feature of the political situation in the working class today is increasing anger and dissatisfaction. However, the working class has been systematically disenfranchised by nationalist bureaucrats that the media and the ruling class falsely promote as the left. And this emerges very, very clearly in the 2002 French presidential election, now over 2 decades ago, that really initiated the election rise of the RN. And I'd like to make a few final points about this. In 2002, millions of workers protested as the collapse of votes for the pro-austerity PS government turned the presidential election suddenly into a runoff between a conservative candidate, Jacques Chirac, and a neo-fascist, Jean-Marie Le Pen. There was outrage at that time among workers that two such illegitimate and unpopular candidates were the only alternatives that were being offered. Now, the critical question, as we explained then, was the independent mobilization of the working class in a struggle for socialism. We issued a call titled "No to Chirac and Le Pen for a working class boycott of the French election." It called on, and I quote, "every organization seeking to defend the working class to campaign actively for a boycott of the May 5th, 2002 presidential vote. No political support to either Le Pen or Chirac. Mobilize French working people and youth against this false and anti-democratic choice." Why a boycott? Because it is necessary to deny any legitimacy to this fraudulent election. Because it is necessary to establish an independent political line for the working class. Because an active and aggressive boycott would create the best conditions for the political struggle that will arise in the aftermath of the elections. Now, the tendencies that make up the new Popular Front today, and their ancestors 20 years ago, the PS, the PCF, the LCR, all reacted by instead endorsing Chirac, the bourgeois right, as a defender of democracy. They in effect ceded to the far right the mantle of opposition to a corrupt and hated political establishment. Since 2002, these parties and union bureaucracies have sold out countless mass protests against pension cuts, labor law reforms, cuts to wage levels, and other austerity measures. Their evident integration into the political setup has goaded masses of embittered, disillusioned, and confused voters to support for the neo-fascists for want of something better to vote for. Now, the coming NATO escalation against Russia, the installation of whatever government will emerge from the deep crisis in France, in other countries, in Britain, will provoke deep-rooted opposition among workers internationally. Explosive crises and rapid shifts in political consciousness are on the agenda in Britain, in France, and around the world. However, such struggles by themselves, as we've seen, cannot address the enormous dangers posed by the crisis of capitalism unless critical political issues are decided amongst advanced workers and youth. A political system that puts forward neo-fascist parties and global war is living on borrowed time. It's a ruling class that has outlived itself. But the capitalist class will not overthrow itself. The decisive issue is the forging of an international revolutionary movement in the working class against imperialism, fascism, capitalism, and for socialism. This requires clearly breaking the grip of Stalinism, popular frontism, laborism, various other forms of pseudo-left politics over the workers and youth, and the grip of allied trade union bureaucracies over workers' struggles. The basis for this is the Trotskyist program for which this meeting is fighting, the program of World Socialist Revolution defended by the ICFI. And I urge all of you who are not already members of this party to seriously read its program and think and consider joining it. Thank you very much.
As I said, comrades, Christoph is perhaps most well known for his volume, Why Are They Back? Today, he's going to speak about the situation that confronted the comrades in Germany in the European elections, in which he was a leading candidate, and the implications of the rise of the far right in Europe, and why, indeed, answer the question, not only why are they back, but how can they be fought? Comrade Christoph.
I'm very pleased to be here because the issues that the British comrades are fighting out are of great importance to workers across the continent, throughout Europe. You are opposing the conspiracy for war behind the backs of the people that Sunak is implementing at the moment. You are fighting against pseudo-left forces like Feinstein, who want to prevent workers from turning to a revolutionary perspective in the face of this situation. They are reheating bankrupt Corbynism to ultimately bind workers to the Labour Party and to the capitalist system. Workers around the world are confronted with the same developments and with the same forces. And they can only defend their rights, and they can only prevent a world war if they unite internationally and declare war on capitalism. The International Committee opposes the growing nationalism with the international unity of the workers in the struggle against capitalism and war. Without such a movement, a catastrophe, a world war, is inevitable. The NATO continues to escalate its war against Russia, risking a nuclear war in which billions of people would die. In Gaza, the same powers are demonstrating the atrocities they are prepared to commit in order to assert their geostrategic aims. And the cost of this madness is borne by the working class with falling wages, cuts in education and healthcare, and with their lives. The opposition to this policy of war and social devastation is enormous, without any question. But outside of our party, it finds no political expression. In Germany, the three governing parties received only a third of the votes in the European elections. In Germany, a third of the votes, the three governing parties. The Chancellor's Party, the SPD, achieved its worst national result in 137 years. They just got 14%, even less than 14%. And the main beneficiary of this was a fascist AfD, which received 16% of the vote. And the election success is not the result of a fascist mass movement, as was the case in Germany in the 1930s. If the right can also win votes among workers, it is because of the bankruptcy of the pseudo-left, which, like Syriza in Greece or the left party in Germany, pushed through the worst social cuts and promoted war policies in the name of left-wing policies. No, the shift to the right does not come from below, from a movement of poor petty bourgeois layers or something like that. It's coming from above. All parties have adapted to the policies of the extreme right. The policies of Scholz in Germany and Meloni in Italy are essentially the same. There's no huge difference between these policies. It consists of genocide, of war, and of dictatorship. Germany is now the second largest arms supplier to Ukraine, and it is aggressively pushing ahead with the war against Russia. The war budget has more than doubled in recent years, and the whole society is being militarized. And this war policy is supported by all parties in the parliament. The former pacifists of the Greens are the most aggressive warmongers today. And the SPD is putting the militarism into practice with technocratic ruthlessness. The Left Party has also backed NATO's war aims and supported the arming of Ukraine. Although Sarah Wagenknecht's splinter party from the Left Party and the AfD oppose the war in Ukraine, they do so from a purely nationalist rather than an anti-militarist standpoint. They support German militarism. They support the rearmament and just want to develop it into a different direction. And all capitalist parties supported the genocide in Gaza even more unanimously. Without exception, all members of the Bundestag, the German parliament, voted in favor of supporting the Israeli genocide and suppressing protests against it. Every single deputy of the parliament. Representatives of the Left Party took part in pro-Israeli demonstrations and called for more aggressive actions to be taken against the main sponsors of Hamas terror, Iran and Hezbollah. That's what the Left Party is promoting in Germany. And the refugee policy of the extreme right is also being implemented by all parties in Germany. After sacrificing education, housing, and health to profits and the war policy, all parties are reaching into the mothballs of fascism and blaming the desperate refugees for the effects of their own policies. The Mediterranean is being turned into a mass grave. And in order to enforce this policy against growing resistance in the working class, all governments in Europe are resorting to the methods of dictatorship. In Germany, this is taking on particularly blatant forms. Anti-war demonstrations have been banned or made subject to strict conditions. Students protesting against the genocide in Gaza are brutally beaten up by the police, and when professors criticize this violence, they are threatened with the withdrawal of research funding. That is what is happening in Germany today. And it's really the height of cynicism when the German elites use the fight against anti-Semitism as an ideological lubricant for the new war machine and the suppression of resistance to it. I know that this is an international phenomenon, but in Germany, the suppression of all opposition to the war in the name of the fight against anti-Semitism is taking on particularly aggressive forms. However, it is not the millions of workers and young people who are showing solidarity with the oppressed Palestinians, but the ruling class that is once again taking up the brown traditions of the Nazis by rolling German tanks against Russia, declaring genocide to be a reason of state, and arming the Bundeswehr like not since Hitler. The whole campaign against anti-Semitism, so-called anti-Semitism, is taking on completely absurd forms. On April 24th, for example, the editor-in-chief of Die Welt, one of the Springer newspapers in Germany, Jennifer Wilton, compared the protests against the genocide at US universities to the Nazis' actions against Jews in the 1930s. And this is not only a disgusting slander of the protests involving thousands of Jewish students, it is an intolerable trivialization of the Nazi crimes. The Nazis did not demonstrate peacefully against a genocide. No, they implemented a genocide. They killed 6 million Jews on an industrial scale. But this conflation of justifying the genocide in Gaza with whitewashing German imperialism of its historical crimes is at the heart of the anti-Semitism campaign in Germany. The German government is not only entering into an alliance with Israel in order to assert its interests in the Middle East, it is also entering into an ideological liaison with Zionism in order to trivialize its own crimes in history. In his book, The Logic of Zionism, which you can also find at the book table, David North explains very well the thoroughly fascist character of Zionism, which is based on a racist myth. Anti-Semitism is not analyzed as a concrete historical phenomenon in Zionist ideology, but is seen as a supra-historical constant that Jews can only oppose by creating their own state. However, the modern anti-Semitism of the Nazis had a different social function than, for example, the medieval anti-Semitism. And it was specifically the fight against socialism. As the social democrat and Hitler biographer Konrad Hayden wrote, Hitler did not repel the labor movement because it was led by Jews, but the Jews repelled him because they led the labor movement. It was not Rothschild the capitalist, but Karl Marx the socialist, who kindled Adolf Hitler's anti-Semitism. The Holocaust itself, the extermination of the Jews, is also closely linked to the war of extermination against the Soviet Union. At least 1 million of the 6 million Jews exterminated by the Nazis were Soviet citizens. In total, over 3/4 of all victims of the Holocaust came from countries that Germany had conquered in the Eastern Campaign, including 3 million Polish Jews alone. It was the greed of German imperialism for the natural resources and markets of the East, and it was the aggressive anti-communism of the ruling class that underlay the monstrous crimes of the Nazis. As German militarism returns and Germany gears up again for war against Russia, the memory of these crimes is increasingly undermined. The Holocaust is being taken out of its historical context, turned into an abstract concept, and then used to justify genocide and incite hatred against immigrants. At the same time, the memory of the 27 million Soviet citizens killed in the war of extermination is systematically ignored. This evil historical distortion is also directed against any serious commemoration of the Holocaust itself, because it is about whitewashing German imperialism. When the Socialist Equality Party, the Sozialistische Gleichheitspartei, and the IYSSE criticized the radical right-wing professor Jörg Barbarowski for describing Hitler as not vicious and trivializing the Holocaust by saying that the Holocaust was essentially the same as shootings in the Russian Civil War, representatives of all parties and all the major media jumped to his defense. The same people who now call peaceful demonstrations against the genocide anti-Semitic defended the defense of Hitler and the trivialization of the Holocaust. And now you can also understand why the fascist AfD is at the spearhead of the fight against anti-Semitism today. This fight against anti-Semitism would have been also supported by the Führer himself. And now you can see what was prepared here ideologically at the Humboldt University with Barbarowski, with Münkler and so on, is being put into practice. A capitalist united front from all the parties in the Bundestag has declared the trivialization of Nazi crimes and the support for genocide to be the Staatsräson, the reason of state. I don't know if there's a clear translation of this term, but as a basis of the state, against which all opposition is to be suppressed. And that is the basis on which the extreme right is being strengthened, because its program is implemented and because the crimes of the Nazis are trivialized and are now used. This falsification of history is now used to commit new crimes and new genocide. And that is the reason why the struggle against the extreme right can only be waged as a struggle against the right-wing policies of all the parties, against the war and against the root of the and the cause of the war, the capitalist system. And there's a strong basis for this struggle. The international working class, the social force that creates all the wealth of society, has to bear the entire burden of war and crisis. Today, the working class is more international and networked than ever before, and is entering into struggle against the war, against social devastation that is taking place all over the world. But for this force to act politically independently, a relentless struggle is needed against the various pseudo-left tendencies that are part of the shift to the right, and who are seeking to bind workers to the rotten capitalist system. Our struggle against the falsification of history has shown how important the struggle on the ideological front is. On this basis, we achieved an important success at Humboldt University in the last elections there, winning 7.7% of the vote, which showed that there is a strong response among students in the fight for socialism and against historical falsification, and for a turn to the working class and for the mobilization of the working class. At the same time, the German Secret Service stepped up his action against us and added the IYSSE just on the eve of the elections to the list of extremist organizations alongside with the SGP. And you can really see how the questions are sharpening up in this political situation, where the ruling elite is entering Third World War and where they are organizing a genocide. And in this situation, it becomes very clear what David North already wrote in his foreword to the book, The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century. He wrote, "History has become a battlefield." And this is very clearly confirmed today. The working class can only defend its rights, can only prevent the catastrophe of a world war if it bases itself on historical truth and on the lessons of history. For this it is necessary to build this party, the Socialist Equality Party in Britain and the ICFI throughout the world. Based on the history of the Marxist movement, it is only this party, that opposes imperialism and doing this with a socialist program. The only way to vote against genocide and war in these elections is to vote for the candidates of the SEP. And that is why I call on all of you to do this and to build this party. The party of historical truth, the party of socialism. Thank you very much.
Well, the eyes of the world at this point, in the aftermath of the presidential election debate, have been fixed on the United States. There's not a major newspaper in Britain, Europe, Asia that is not obsessing over what on earth does it mean that the American election is being decided, who runs the most important country in the world between Biden, who is clearly cognitively impaired, and Donald Trump. Well, you can pore through it all and you won't find any answer or explanation of this mounting dilemma, not simply for the American ruling class, but for the imperialist powers all over the world. Tonight, this afternoon, you're going to be given such an explanation. Comrade Joe Kishore.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, comrades. I'm very honored to be able to speak at the final rally of the Socialist Equality Party election campaign here in London, and to bring the greetings of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States to this very important event. I think it is entirely appropriate that the final rally takes the form that it does, that is, as an international event. There is no national, let alone local, solution to the problems we confront. The COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the intensifying climate crisis, expose the inability of capitalist governments mired in national conflicts and beholden to corporate interests to protect public health. The ruling classes in every country are turning towards authoritarianism and fascism. Social inequality is at record levels throughout the world, driven by a global economic system that benefits a tiny elite at the expense of the vast majority of the population. And above all, as has been reviewed today, escalating global war threatens humanity's very existence. These are, again, global problems, and therefore the solutions must be global. As Chris indicated, workers and young people throughout the world are carefully following political developments in the United States. I had the opportunity to campaign with Comrade Tom yesterday here in London. And a question on the minds of many people is, what is happening in America? Perhaps with the addition of a few colorful words. The political system seems to have descended into an abyss. And one can certainly say that the debate that was held just a few days ago on Thursday night between Biden and Trump, the two candidates of the Democratic and Republican parties, was one of the most degrading spectacles in the history of American politics. Now, much of the media commentary in the United States and throughout the world has focused on the evident cognitive decline of the American president, who, after all, as commander-in-chief, has the sole authority to initiate a nuclear war. There are calls from some within the political establishment for Biden to step aside. What, however, would be the aim of such a change in the candidate of the Democratic Party? What policies would it be intended to facilitate? In a word, war. That has been the priority of the Biden administration over the past 3.5 years. Indeed, during the course of the debate, Biden was, as he is always when it comes to his public appearances, most articulate, or perhaps in this case, only articulate, in the demands of the military intelligence apparatus that the Democratic Party represents. On the question of the U.S. support for the genocide in Gaza, Biden declared, "We are providing Israel with all the weapons they need and when they need them." Indeed, American imperialism is arming as well as financially backing and politically justifying a genocide that has provoked revulsion and anger all over the world. In 9 months of merciless bombardment, more than 40,000 Palestinians, the majority women and children, have been murdered. And there is not a single building that has been destroyed or bomb dropped or child murdered in Palestine that has not been done so with the support of the United States and with the Biden administration. It was recently revealed in a Reuters article that the Biden government since October 7th has provided Israel with 14,000 2,000-pound bombs, which are used to level entire neighborhoods. Netanyahu, the Israeli Hitler, is due to speak at a joint session of Congress on July 24th, just a few weeks away, to give what amounts to a progress report to American imperialism and its two capitalist parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. Now, for American imperialism, the genocide in Gaza is seen as part of and inextricably connected to a regional and global war, including the escalating US-NATO war against Russia in Ukraine. On this point, Biden declared that the US would do everything in its power to counter efforts by Putin, he said, quote, to reestablish what was part of the Soviet Empire by conquering all of Ukraine along with Eastern Europe. Now, this places reality on its head. The Biden administration and its NATO allies provoked the Russian invasion of Ukraine now more than 2 years ago through the continuous expansion of NATO to the east. It has relentlessly escalated the war since, rejecting any measures that would bring it to an end. As other speakers tonight have noticed, in just 2 weeks, in the immediate aftermath of the elections in the UK and in France, the NATO powers are holding a conference in Washington, D.C. to discuss and finalize plans for the further shipment of NATO weapons to Ukraine that will be used to target Russia, as well as the already advanced preparations for the direct deployment of NATO troops into the conflict. At the beginning of this month, Biden traveled here to Europe as part of the official commemoration of D-Day, an event which was devoted to warmongering threats against Russia. And Biden explicitly referred to the fact that American troops would soon be dying once again in their thousands in a European war to defend democracy, as he put it. There is, in fact, growing talk within Congress of the reintroduction and expansion of the draft. And as always, when there's talk, it means that the decision has already been made and they're working out how to do it. But this has provoked widespread concern and outrage among workers and young people in the United States. I was at an event, election campaign event in Detroit about a week ago, and many young people were speaking about their concerns about the reintroduction of the draft. The war is not popular in the working class. And who believes all the talk about democracy? The active participation of the US and NATO powers in the genocide in Gaza must obliterate for all time the notion that American foreign policy has anything to do with human rights. In Ukraine itself, the puppet regime operates on the basis of martial law. Opposition parties have been outlawed, elections have been canceled, fascists have been elevated into the highest levels of the state. Facing growing domestic opposition, the Zelensky regime is moving against its opponents and responding with repression, most significantly in the arrest of our comrade Bogdan, who's been imprisoned on the false and slanderous allegation of supporting the Russian government. Such are the real priorities of the Democratic Party: war. Whether it is Biden at its head or someone else, it is a party of war, of imperialism, of the military intelligence apparatus of Wall Street, and the corporate financial oligarchy that is directing this increasingly reckless militarist policy. Biden's opponent in the election, of course, is Donald Trump, the fascist con man who had Hitler's speeches on his bedside table, who just 3.5 years ago staged a coup that was aimed at overturning the results of the election, the 2020 elections, and establishing a personalist dictatorship. Trump has focused his comments, including at the debate and elsewhere, on a violent attack on immigrants and refugees, a talk of deploying the National Guard and the military in cities throughout the United States to arrest immigrants. The very fact that Trump remains at the head of the Republican Party, one of the two parties of the American ruling class, testifies to the deep-going rot of American democracy. At the time of his nomination in 2016, prior to his election, we remarked that Trump's fascistic personality was forged not in the beer halls of Munich and the trenches of World War I, but in the real estate market of New York City. With his casinos, his fictional universities, and his endless stream of failed businesses, we wrote, this personification of corporate fraud could hardly be a more fitting symbol for the state of American capitalism. I think this has been confirmed over the intervening period. Trump oversaw the initial response of the American ruling class to the pandemic, with the president spearheading a policy of mass infection, a policy that in fact has been continued and indeed fully implemented under Biden. An estimated 1.4 million Americans have now been killed by COVID, and over 20 million debilitated with long COVID. Figures that rise with each new wave of mass infection, as is the case globally and here in the UK now. The attempted coup of January 6, 2021 was a political turning point in American and indeed in world politics. With the support of significant sections of the ruling class and military state apparatus, the sitting president sought to stop the transfer of power, and he nearly succeeded. That Trump could very well win the presidency in the upcoming elections is the product, on the one hand, of the turn of the ruling elites towards authoritarianism and dictatorship, and on the other hand, the thoroughly right-wing character of the official opposition. The response of Biden and the Democrats to the coup 2021 was to insist on the need for a strong Republican Party, the better to prosecute war abroad and the war on the working class at home. Indeed, more recently, the Democrats have forged a bipartisan alliance with the Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson, and they all appeared on a panel on the anniversary of the Holocaust, of all things. Johnson, Biden, the heads of the Democrats and Republicans in Congress, to denounce students protesting the genocide as anti-Semitic. Johnson himself compared students who were outraged over the genocide to the Nazi academics who helped implement the Holocaust. Such outrages. But Biden was there, of course, praising Johnson. The basis of that alliance is support for the war, for the genocide, and for the war against Russia. This is a choice that the American people are given in the election. To speak of a lesser evil between the two parties is politically meaningless. They are two representatives of the corporate and financial oligarchy that is driving the entire world toward catastrophe. And it's important to emphasize again the two parties. The Democratic Socialists of America had a statement recently in which they call for Biden to step down and for someone else to take his place. Of course, Genocide Joe is a perfectly apt and correct term for the President of the United States, who will never be able to wash the blood from his hands for his participation, indeed direction of the genocide. But it's not just Biden, it's the Democratic Party. It's the two parties of the capitalist ruling elite. To understand what is happening in America, however, it's not just necessary to examine the current political situation, but to review the underlying objective factors and place the present situation in its historical context. The elections here in the UK are being held on July 4th, which happens to be the anniversary of the American Declaration of Independence. The document of the American Revolution sounded the tocsin for bourgeois democratic revolutions throughout the world, proclaiming the right of revolt against unjust governments and the principle rooted in the Enlightenment that all men are created equal. The leaders of the American Revolution subsequently spelled out the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, proclaimed in the Declaration in the Bill of Rights, which guaranteed freedom of speech, religion, the press and assembly, freedom from detention without trial, freedom from arbitrary searches and seizure. The American Revolution was followed 85 years later by the Second American Revolution, the Civil War, which culminated in the abolition of chattel slavery and the greatest redistribution of wealth prior to the Russian Revolution of 1917. Now, in light of these anniversaries, one can ask the question, what remains today of the democratic principles proclaimed and established in the revolutionary struggles of the early days of American capitalism? Well, to ask the question is to answer it. Everywhere they are under assault. The Supreme Court of the United States, controlled by a gang of fascists, corrupt fascists at that, is waging a rampage against the Bill of Rights. Students and workers protesting the genocide in Gaza have been arrested in the thousands. The institutions of the capitalist state, from the Congress of millionaires to the executive presidency to the military state police apparatus, exists as a permanent conspiracy against the interests of the vast majority of the population, the working class. Now, the crisis of American democracy did not begin with the president election. It has been developing over an extended period of time. Nearly a quarter century ago, analyzing the theft of the 2000 elections in which the Supreme Court intervened to stop the recounting of ballots and hand the presidency to George W. Bush. At that time, the Socialist Equality Party and the World Socialist website explained that the outcome demonstrated that there exists no significant constituency within the ruling class for democratic rights. That event was followed by the War on Terror, Guantanamo Bay, torture as an instrument of imperialist foreign policy, the horrors of Abu Ghraib, which perhaps have only been exceeded now by what has been revealed of the torture of Palestinians by the Israeli regime, drone assassination under Obama, the persecution of Julian Assange, who's finally received his freedom this month, as well as that of Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, and other whistleblowers, endless waves of police killings, the rise of Donald Trump, and the fascist insurrection of January 6th, and now the Biden administration, and Genocide Joe. The basic objective cause of this political degeneration is the extreme growth of social inequality. American society is dominated by an oligarchy whose wealth has been accumulated through financial fraud, speculation, and the ever more extreme exploitation of the working class. Just last month, Tesla shareholders agreed to award Elon Musk, the fascistic owner of the company and the company's CEO, and also the owner of Twitter, one of the largest social media companies in the world, agreed to award Musk with a pay package of $45 billion, an amount which really is incomprehensible to the vast majority of the world population. It's 1.2 million times the median income in the United States. That is, one worker earning the median income would have to work 1.2 million years, if he was lucky to live that long, to earn the amount handed out to Musk in a single bonus. But Musk, in his extreme wealth, epitomizes the connection between financial parasitism, political reaction, and intellectual stupidity characteristic of the ruling oligarchy. And he's hardly alone. In November 2023, U.S. billionaires' collective wealth reached a record $5.2 trillion, increasing enormously during the course of the pandemic. By the third quarter, the top 10% of Americans owned 2/3 of the country's wealth, while the bottom half owned just 2.6%. The top 10 owned over 66% of the wealth, and the bottom half only 2.6%. The wealth of the oligarchy is bound up with their control over the gigantic corporations through the mechanism of the stock market. This oligarchy presides over an economic and social system in deep crisis. The proclamations of the end of history, the unipolar moment, which greeted the dissolution of the Soviet Union 35 years ago, have proven to be short-lived. The financial system is sustained by a series of massive multi-trillion-dollar handouts made possible through the printing of money by the Federal Reserve. And a significant factor in the ever more reckless warmongering of the ruling class is concern over the fate of the dollar, which threatens to undermine the whole edifice of the American financial and economic system. Trotsky once compared democratic forms of rule to a system of safety switches and circuit breakers for the protection against currents overloaded by the national or social struggles. He said, when internal and international contradictions become too high, the safety switches of democracy either burn out or explode. Extending the analogy, one could say that the United States today, that not only are the currents overpowering the circuits, but the wires have become rusted and corroded, and the entire mechanism mired in muck and filth. The extreme backwardness of official political life in the United States, so clearly expressed in these elections, is inextricably connected to the decades-long suppression of the class struggle, accompanied by a war on socialist thought, on Marxism. This war has been waged not only by the ruling class, but by its various adjuncts, the proponents of identity politics, of racial and gender division, the politics of the upper middle class, what we have referred to as the pseudo-left, has played a critical role in suppressing opposition to capitalism and opposing a politics based on the working class, of legitimizing and supporting imperialist war. Workers and young people in the United States, and indeed internationally, now have a significant experience with the likes of Bernie Sanders, the American Corbyn, along with Democratic Socialist of America member Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others. Perhaps could be likened to the American Feinstein, They promised reform, and even in the case of Sanders, a political revolution. But they have delivered nothing but establishment politics, imperialist politics. They all have backed the war against Russia, voted for $61 billion to finance that war, criticizing the genocide in Gaza. That's the bad genocide, which they criticize as a cover for Biden. All of them are declaring that there's no option but to vote for Biden in the elections. But they all support the good war, the war against Russia in Ukraine. They are pro-imperialist establishment politicians. As for the trade union apparatus, it has been integrated ever more directly into the state and corporate management. In the United States, the Biden administration has elevated Shawn Fain, the president of the United Auto Workers, who is backed by the DSA. Fain has joined hands with Biden in declaring that the working class must be the arsenal of democracy. In reality, the arsenal of genocide. That is, that the interests of workers must be sacrificed at the altar of militarism and war. There is, however, a powerful social force within the United States, the American working class, which in alliance with its class brothers and sisters in every country has the social power to overthrow imperialism. There's a powerful history of class struggle in America, from the Haymarket martyrs, the fight for the 8-hour day, through the sit-down and general strikes of the 1930s, which established the industrial unions, through the massive battles of the 1970s, including insurrectionary struggles in the coal mines. The Achilles heel of the American working class has always been its subordination to capitalist politics, in particular the Democratic Party, in which the apparatus of the trade unions has played a dominant role. But there are, however, many signs of a shift in the political situation, of a breaking up of the decades of enforced suppression of the class struggle, of the stultifying atmosphere of the official reactionary politics. In 2022, amidst a systematic campaign of voter suppression in the elections in the United Auto Workers, 5,000 auto workers voted for Will Lehman for president on the basis of a socialist and internationalist program that called for the abolition of the trade union apparatus and the transfer of power to the rank and file. Over the past several months, hundreds of thousands of workers and young people in the US, as well as in Britain, of course, and internationally, have participated in demonstrations against the genocide in Gaza. The stranglehold of the capitalist two parties is maintained not through broad popular support, there is not, but through every mechanism of political and ideological rigidity, through censorship in the mass media, through the massively undemocratic measures aimed at excluding any genuine expression of the interests of the working class. People are always shocked, even in the United States, when we explain that just to get on the ballot, which we are trying to do in this election campaign, just to get on the ballot in all 50 states in the United States, one would have to gather more than 1 million signatures. The Democrats, whose own candidate may be forced to drop out, has declared an all-out war on third parties and independent candidates in order to prevent workers and youth from being able to vote for someone else. In our campaign, however, we have spoken to hundreds of thousands. We've encountered deep and abiding hatred of both capitalist parties, which has only been heightened by last week's debate. Now, I've referred to the situation in the United States, but none of these issues are unique to America, as the other speakers have made clear. They are present in different forms in every country. The crisis takes a particularly acute form in the United States because of the centrality of American capitalism and American imperialism. But these are particular national expressions of global tendencies. We live in a period of shocks, sharp transformations, mass protests and demonstrations of snap elections and the downfall of governments. The situation can shift very rapidly. It is shifting rapidly. The critical question is the development within the working class of a political leadership capable of orienting the masses toward the conquest of power and the socialist transformation of economic and social life. The problems we confront now are serious, matters of life and death. They require serious solutions and serious politics. Those who promise a way out by tinkering around the edges of a bankrupt social and economic system are selling snake oil. Trotsky once referred to the priests of half-truths, of quarter-truths, that is the worst form of falsehoods. In order to meet the challenges that we confront, it is necessary to bring forward the experiences of the past, to reappropriate the great traditions of Marxism, of socialism. These traditions are embedded in the history of the Trotskyist movement, the International Committee of the Fourth International, and nowhere else. Nowhere else can the great answers to the great questions that millions of workers and young people can be found, for the ICFI embodies the great experiences of the great struggles. So in conclusion, I urge you to vote. Vote for Tom, vote for Darren, and build the leadership, the Socialist Equality Party, in the working class, which is the aim of the SEP campaign here in the UK and in the United States, and in the work of the ICFI throughout the world. We have the highest political confidence that the working class, armed with this perspective, will fight and will win.
Thank you very much for that, Joe. Our final speaker is Tom Scripps. He's, I'm sure no one here was considering voting for Keir Starmer. We won't be trying to convince you of that. We've been fighting to clarify the basic political issues confronting the working class. I did just before, very briefly, I know we're running on time, but I did want to give a word of the general election statement of our supposed rival, Andrew Feinstein. This is what you've been hearing if this was a meeting called by Collective. I'm standing in this general election because I see our voice being ignored and our support taken for granted. I see our communities used only as stepping stones towards further power. I believe that MPs should serve only local people, not party machines or corporate interests. They must listen to the local voices, not the establishment. I am running on the issues people face every day, on the issues no party machine can fix. In other words, he's running on whatever will get him into office. Comrades, I give you Tom Scripps.
Let me begin by thanking again our international comrades for being here and for addressing this rally. Their experience, their insight into the world political situation as it manifests in the countries in which they work is really essential to us. We really appreciate them taking the time out of their very busy schedules, as you've heard, including 2 ongoing elections, to be with us here today. Now, the British general election too is of international significance. Rishi Sunak called his snap poll, despite the likely catastrophic consequences for his party, because he was told to do so by Washington and by those of the British state closest to the White House and the Pentagon. The Tories, as we all know, have been mired in crisis ever since Boris Johnson's disgrace and removal 2 years ago. And this could not be tolerated a moment longer, because British imperialism is a key ally of the United States in its waging war all over the world. It is, of course, a major partner in Israel's US-backed genocide of the Palestinians and the military build-up of the imperialist powers in the Middle East, participating in military strikes against the Houthis in Yemen. And it must now redouble that involvement with Netanyahu's planned war with Lebanon and US imperialism's equally planned for war with Iran. In Ukraine, the UK has trained tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers, supplied advanced weaponry, and sent in SAS special forces, all from the very outset of the conflict, a conflict that was provoked by NATO through constant encroachment towards Russia, including the 2014 Maidan coup, installing a pro-Western regime of outright fascists. And now this war is entering a new and extraordinarily dangerous phase of direct conflict between the NATO powers and Russia. NATO governments have signed off, as you have heard, on allowing missiles they supply to be used to strike Russian territory, and they are openly planning to send their own soldiers into the fight in the hope of collapsing the Putin government, installing a puppet regime, even breaking up the country to secure access to its resources and remove an obstacle to the planned war with China. The wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East are two fronts of the same very rapidly expanding war, funded, equipped and driven by the imperialist powers and their proxies as part of a new drive for a redivision of the world, of the kind that led humanity into 2 world wars in the 20th century. Now, a new government was needed in Britain to wage that war, even if it meant, in all likelihood, Sunak falling on his sword, because the overwhelming choice to lead that government in ruling circles is the Labour Party. It received the Sunday Times' endorsement just today. It is now openly seeking the Sun's. Now, the media's brown-nosing of Starmer is a verdict on how far to the right it has travelled. The party's left wing, such as it was, has been expunged, and its nominal leader, Jeremy Corbyn, is gone. Starmer and the rest have wooed the City of London, defined themselves as the most business-friendly party in British history, promised no more public spending and no taxes on business or the wealthy. Figures such as the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, frankly relish every opportunity to denounce strikers and any worker wanting so much as a modest pay rise. And Starmer himself promises to make sure that such demands are policed by his allies in the trade union bureaucracy. But none of this counts for as much as Labour's proving itself a worthy replacement for the Tories as a party of Zionism and as the party of NATO. July 4th was the only date an election could be held before the decisive NATO summit in Washington, July 9th through 12th, which will plan the next stage in the war against Russia. Starmer will have been in number 10 for a few days before jetting off to Washington, D.C. as Britain's de facto wartime Prime Minister. Despite Sunak's own announcing that the election was about national security, taking place, as he said, at a time when the world is more dangerous than it has been since the end of the Cold War. And despite Keir Starmer responding that with Labour, national security always comes first, and his repeated promises of his readiness to use nuclear weapons, we are alone as a party in warning of the grave dangers facing the working class. As we say in our manifesto, the SEP is using this election to break the conspiracy of silence maintained by the capitalist media, the major parties and the trade unions, and what passes for the left. And in insisting that a vote for Starmer and Labour is a vote for austerity, repression, genocide and war, a vote for the Socialist Equality Party is a vote for equality, peace and socialism, and that we intend to build a socialist alternative. Now, there are, of course, many candidates in this election standing to protest the genocide in Gaza, but they all do so while refusing to make the obvious connection between British imperialism's support for mass murder and ethnic cleansing by Israel and the war it provoked and is participating in Ukraine, that has already cost, it should be remembered, hundreds of thousands of lives, and will cost far, far more unless it is stopped. We are not opposed only to Starmer, and only because of his filthy statements justifying the destruction of Gaza by proclaiming Israel's right to defend itself. We oppose the Labour Party as a whole, including the handful of lefts who cry crocodile tears over Gaza while planning to take their seats in a Starmer government. Against all the other candidates and campaigns in this election, including that of Andrew Feinstein here in Holborn and St Pancras, we call for workers to build a new socialist and internationalist party, and we say the time to do so is now. The working class, and especially the younger generation, need to understand that war is the major issue on which a new socialist movement must be built. All the attacks faced by the working class, the savage austerity, the destruction of democratic rights, the whipping up of anti-migrant xenophobia, and the use and cultivation of the far right that has already been addressed by my comrades and seen here in the rise of reform, cannot be understood or fought unless the working class takes the decision to oppose war. The Labour government, which, barring the biggest upset in political history, will be in power in a week's time, is not the Blair government of 1997. Geopolitical and class tensions are far more advanced. Starmer's will prove to be the most right-wing, anti-working class government in British history. Before they have even taken office, Labour is already associated with phrases such as ad infinitum, fiscal responsibility, and denunciations of big government checkbooks, turning on the spending taps, and in a popular refrain, magic money tree economics. But the demand now in ruling circles is to go further still, for an end to the peace dividend, and for billions more to be spent on the armed forces. That is why Starmer's main pre-election spending pledge is a triple lock on the funding and refitting of Britain's nuclear weapons. There will also be more backing for the police and the security services, with Labour refusing to say they will scrap anti-protest laws brought in by the Tory government. And who would expect them to? Given that they are led by a man who set up 24-hour courts to imprison young people during the London riots, who took a leading role in the persecution of Julian Assange, and whose party slanders protesters against the genocide in Gaza as extremists, hate marchers, and anti-Semites. At the start of the war in Ukraine, too, it should be remembered, Starmer attacked, quote, the likes of the Stop the War coalition as being, at best, naive. At worst, they actively give succor to authoritarian leaders who directly threaten democracies. You should look somewhat closer to home. But Starmer and the Labour Party are not going to have it all their own way. We are not going to have to put up with their smug satisfaction at their victory for very long. Because very quickly the working class is going to realise the deeply right-wing character of this new government. And the movement over Gaza, the strike movement of 2022-23, the huge sense of dissatisfaction and anger with the state of society, which has been held in check by the trade union bureaucracy and Labour's innumerable pseudo-left apologists, will explode. The same conditions that give rise to war, we are convinced, give rise to revolutionary movements of the working class. Starmer's will be a government of crisis and class struggle. Our task is to train political leaders who can intervene, educate, and win large numbers of workers and young people looking for a way forward against war, austerity and authoritarianism, and for a socialist perspective. That is the purpose of our campaign in this election. We took the decision to stand in Holborn and St Pancras against Starmer to underscore this essential question facing the working class: the need for a total break with the Labour Party and for the building of a revolutionary alternative. But as Chris has said, the Socialist Equality Party has also had to clarify the crucial political differences between ourselves and the campaigns of Andrew Feinstein and the collective group of independent candidates, which are advanced constantly by groups such as the Socialist Workers' Party and the Revolutionary Communist Party as the alternative to Starmer, even as they still call for a Labour vote everywhere else. We have been asked in this campaign by a small number of people to stand aside for the more viable anti-Starmer candidate. We have not, and we will not do so. Collectives politics confines mass opposition to the Labour Party, expressed most clearly in the movement against Gaza, against the Gaza genocide, to a programme of minimal reforms, pacifist appeals, and even at this stage, of pressuring the Labour Party. Its programme is based on the 5 demands of the Peace and Justice Project, expressly formulated by Jeremy Corbyn to avoid a fundamental clash with the Labour Party. These vague reformist demands for a pay rise for the many, a Green New Deal, housing for all, taxing the rich to save the NHS, and welcoming refugees in a world free from war, are to be the foundation of a new party at some undefined point in the future. And meanwhile, Corbyn has the space to run a purely personal campaign in Islington North without challenging the Labour Party nationally, and Feinstein to do the same in the neighbouring constituency. Collective can declare its support for, quote, most Labour candidates in the Socialist campaign group, rocking the Labour boat but not sinking it. Collective combines opposition to the Gaza genocide with implacable opposition to any struggle for the political independence of the working class and its mobilisation against capitalism and imperialism, which alone can bring an end to the genocide and the spiral to world war. It champions an anti-class politics of the people, which is a recipe for bourgeois political alliances like the New Popular Front, described by Alex in France, which subordinate the interests and the struggles of the working class to the political representatives of the affluent middle class and their limited grievances over who gets what within capitalism. It is vitally important that workers and young people draw the central lessons of Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. Namely, that the Labour Party cannot be pressured to the left, much less transformed into a vehicle for socialism. And that Corbyn and any party he heads represent the politics of political demobilisation and defeat. Corbyn, of course, came to the leadership of the Labour Party 9 years ago on the crest of a left-wing surge of workers and especially young people who wanted him to kick out the Blairites, fight against austerity and war. But he spent his 5 years as Labour leader sabotaging that movement and preaching unity with Labour's broad church. His 2 most significant retreats, by someone, remember, who became party leader while chair of the Stop the War coalition, were over British imperialism's wars and the anti-Semitism witch hunt. Within a year of becoming Labour leader, Corbyn allowed his MPs a free vote on the British bombing campaign in Syria. He twice went to the polls on a manifesto committed to NATO membership, its required level of defence spending, and Britain's nuclear war programme. When the military and the security services nonetheless raised threats of mutiny against his premiership and even his life, Corbyn refused even to sound the alarm. When his supporters were witch-hunted as anti-Semites for opposing Zionism and Israel's persecution of the Palestinians, Corbyn allowed even some of his closest allies to be expelled from the Labour Party. By the end of his time in office, his leadership was actively carrying out expulsions, and it was under Corbyn that Labour adopted the pro-Zionist IHRA definition, so-called, of anti-Semitism. It is thanks to Corbyn that we now have millions of Gaza protesters accused of anti-Semitism, and that we have Starmer poised to take office in less than a week's time. He stymied mass left anti-war sentiment, which could have been organised into a political challenge against the whole British imperialist setup. Now today, of course, we have the mass movement underway over Gaza. There is mass social discontent and hunger for change. Starmer is forecast to win a landslide, but with a combined vote total with the Tories expected to be the lowest since the Second World War. There are millions of people who will never vote Labour again, and tens of millions more who do so only under sufferance. Now, these are conditions in which a revolutionary party can be built. Corbyn and Collective would channel oppositional sentiment into the dead end of fundamentally pro-capitalist politics with a left gloss, like Syriza in Greece or Podemos in Spain. He described both as a model for the Labour Party under his leadership. And now that that project has come to its disastrous end, the Corbynites are having a go at building their own separate party. Again, workers should draw the lessons of recent history. Syriza's anti-socialism saw it sabotage a mass movement of the Greek working class against European Union-mandated austerity and rule as the enforcers of finance capital, of the EU's fortress Europe, and Greece's NATO allies. And Podemos has its own similar record of political betrayal in Spain. This is where you end up if you do not take a principled stand for a resolutely socialist internationalist politics based on the working class, which is what we stand for. The SEP is a revolutionary socialist party rooted in the historical experiences of the international working class, the traditions of Marxism and Trotskyism, and the lessons of the struggles against social democracy and Stalinism. This history is the essential political foundation for workers and young people to wage a political struggle against imperialist war, genocide, the vicious class war of the oligarchs, and the move to dictatorship. We have fought in this election to raise these issues and discuss them as widely as we can, to prepare a new layer of socialist workers and young people for the struggles ahead. And we will continue that work after the election. July 4th, the night of the vote, is not the end of our campaign. What matters for us is building our party, recruiting new members. We want more than your vote. We want your commitment to take up the fight for socialism, to educate yourselves in Marxism, and play your part in rebuilding a world socialist movement. All sorts of alternatives to socialism have been tried since the 2008 financial crisis that reopened these political questions for millions of people around the world. The Occupy movement, the Pink Tide, the Indignados and Podemos, Syriza, left populism, Mélenchon, Corbyn. The balance sheet has already been drawn on these failures. It's time to draw conclusions. It's time to return to the revolutionary politics of Marx, Engels, Lenin and Trotsky, and turn to the Fourth International, led today by the International Committee and represented in the UK by the Socialist Equality Party. The revolutionary socialism of Bolshevism is the only political movement which has ever brought a halt to imperialist war and overthrown capitalism. We say take your place in the anti-war movement, fight for a socialist alternative to the Labour Party, and join the Socialist Equality Party today. Thank you.
time, as always, is running away with us, but this is an opportunity for anyone who wants to ask any question of Comrade Tom or anyone on the panel. I will propose that we take a list of speakers and then any questions that anyone wants to ask, and then try and answer them in a kind of ordered fashion, if that's okay. So are there any questions that anyone wants to raise? Over there?
I don't mean to sound really silly, and I love what I've heard, I really love it. But I thought this just be another animal farm.
Okay. Anyone else? Any other questions at all? Don't feel that they have to be all-encompassing. If you've got an issue you want to clarify, just feel free. No? Lady in the mask. You get that? Yeah. We'd like to know why there are so few of us. So we're just getting the small questions now. Animal farm and the size of the socialist movement. Nobody wants to know about the rates, I take it. Any other questions? Right, well, I would propose that Tom is given the responsibility of addressing the issue of the present size of the socialist movement, and also the issue of the danger of political degeneration of that movement.
Taking them in order, well, what you're raising in that is the experience of Stalinism, the bureaucratic counter-revolution against Bolshevism and against socialism that took hold in the Soviet Union, and which the Trotskyist movement, which we represent, was, is, and always will be the most ferocious, determined opponents. Stalinism was not in any way the natural growth of socialism, it was its destruction. And it emerged out of the technological and cultural backwardness, the isolation, and terrible destruction wrought on the fledgling Soviet Union, the aftermath of the Russian Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, by its imperialist opponents. It was the Trotskyist movement which formulated the sole political perspective and program for breaking out of that situation, which was the program of permanent revolution and of international socialism. The understanding that the situation in Russia and the Soviet Union could not be solved within that single territory by itself, but only by the expansion of the world socialist revolution, particularly in the more economically developed countries, the potential for which, as a matter of historical record, clearly existed, perhaps most strikingly in Germany, and Trotsky drew the most far-reaching conclusions from the lessons of what was referred to as the missed October Revolution in Germany in 1923. But one can point to many countries across Europe and many experiences in which the same would apply: Bulgaria, Romania, Britain, in the course of the general strike in 1926. We have comrades here who are able to speak on these experiences, particularly in Germany and France, far better than myself. And Trotskyism was a program for the development of the revolution throughout the world in these countries through the leadership, the vitally necessary leadership of a vanguard party, a revolutionary party. Now, it's true, of course, that historically, particularly throughout the 20th century, the lying equation of Stalinism with socialism has been used as a propaganda tool of the ruling class. I think it's one, it remains something that any socialist has to be clear on, but I think it's one that has somewhat less purchase, particularly among younger layers. And it is one that is perhaps being increasingly abandoned by the ruling class in favour of a more direct assault on socialism and on the figures, the heroic figures associated with the Russian Revolution, Lenin and Trotsky. Our movement has taken up a defence of a campaign of historical falsification and slander of these figures, comrades in Germany in particular. A campaign of falsification and slander which, by the time we reached the centenary of the Russian Revolution in 2017, took the form of open calls in bourgeois newspapers for the policy, the policy that should have been followed in Russia in 1917 by the ruling class there was the much faster, more expedited assassination or execution of Lenin and the leaders of the Bolshevik Party. That's where the ruling class is today. It is increasingly hysterical in its denunciation of socialism. As to why we are so few, that explains part of it. The building of a socialist movement is not the whipping up of mass support quickly on the basis of a few phrases. It is the working through of the most essential historical strategic experiences of the working class through the whole experience, in particular, of the 20th century. The revolutionary struggles mounted by the working class against capitalism in country after country, the lessons of the success that was achieved in the lands of the Soviet Union, and the lessons of where revolutions were betrayed, led to defeat in other countries around the world. The Trotskyist movement, our movement, is the store of those historical, worked through historical experiences. It is the inoculation of the working class against those defeats and those betrayals in the future. It's not a simple task at all to construct such a movement. This is the movement which, in a sense, it is the hardest to build because it is the movement which has the greatest task before it, the greatest task in political history, the overthrowing of world capitalism and the imperialist system. So one has to engage in a long process of education and agitation. That said, it's a common understanding in our movement that there are decades in which nothing happens, and days or years in which decades happen. As Joe said, this is a period in history in which we will see major dramatic shifts. You cannot have a situation in which the imperialist powers are moving towards a potentially world-ending war, a world war, a world-ending war, making those preparations which require a redoubling of austerity that has already brought particularly this society to its knees, which is just obliterating lives. You cannot have that situation without mass movements of people, and the ruling class know it, and we need to start understanding it as well as the ruling class understand it. They are not bringing in dictatorial protest laws and anti-strike laws and strengthening the police and creating the legal framework for locking people up for so-called political extremism for the hell of it. They know they're going to confront a mass movement. That's not in question for us. What is in question, and the raison d'etre of the Trotskyist movement, is the leadership that that mass movement takes on. And with the proper revolutionary socialist leadership, it can achieve the objectives that we've set out before us, that we all share, an end to the genocide in Gaza, to the other war crimes and wars that will emerge if we continue down the trajectory that the ruling class has set for us. So we're not naive about the challenges that confront us, but we recognize that if we are to have a future, then we must confront those challenges, and we know that the conditions are there for us to do so.
I would like to say something about Animal Farm, because I think it's the big issue amongst broad layers of otherwise socialist inclined workers and young people. You know, what's to stop it all going terribly wrong again? Look, Orwell was a brilliant writer. He was someone who was attracted to the socialist movement and actually went and fought in the Spanish Civil War. But he was then completely disillusioned by the rise of Stalinism. He basically thought that, you know, this was really, it had all come to a terrible end, something really horrible. He was intent on actually, one of the reasons why he wrote Animal Farm was because he was, you know, very much supportive of the struggle against Hitler, and yet he saw that, you know, he worked with the security services, and he saw the glorification of Joseph Stalin, Uncle Joe, and he wrote his allegory to, because he says, well, how the hell's this happened? You know, Stalinism is a horrible dictatorship. And so he developed the allegory, and everybody knows it now. You know, at the end, you can't tell the difference between the animals who were the revolutionaries and the humans who they were supposed to have overthrown. And the main Stalin character was Napoleon, and Trotsky was given the really cynical name Snowball, who runs away in the book. And then 4 years later, he writes 1984, which is another novel that haunts us all, about a totalitarian dictatorship, you know, peace, war is peace, you know, and all the rest, and they've passed into the national consciousness. Well, look, while he was completely demoralized, the character which he said ran away, Leon Trotsky, Snowball, was fighting to build a new revolutionary leadership in the working class against insurmountable odds, odds which ended with his assassination. But the party he built was one that was based upon the revolutionary perspective that had led to the October Revolution of 1917. And it was informed by the struggle against the degeneration of that revolution because of its isolation. And the fight to reorient the working class on the perspective of socialist internationalism against the nationalist perspective of building socialism in one country, which was responsible for all of the disasters suffered by the working class in the 1930s, which was responsible for the outbreak of the Second World War, and which had a devastating impact on the consciousness of millions of workers in the post-war period. Now, these parties are all collapsing. When we speak about Keir Starmer's Labour Party, the complete degeneration of that party, you're looking at the political shipwreck of all of the Stalinist parties, all of the social democratic parties. And that's a big shock to a lot of workers because they trusted those parties. They voted for them, even with all their criticisms. And now it's possible to clarify issues. So when Tom says a lot can happen very shortly, the most important thing here is that finally there can be an historical reckoning with the parties that betrayed the working class and a struggle to build the party which represents the historical interests of the working class. And that is an enormously powerful thing, which is not manifested simply by, you know, we'll see a slow accumulation of membership in the next period. A big political shift is coming in the loyalties of millions upon millions of workers. And we're going to challenge for that. We want to lead that. And do we offer any guarantees? No, we don't. But if we don't, then yes, all is lost. But there is a fight to be had, and we're going to wage it. I want to thank everyone for coming here. I really do. This is It's not over till the fat lady sings, as they say. We've got a campaign that's going to be waged right up to Thursday and beyond. But this has been an important event, a milestone in our campaign. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to convince people to dedicate their lives to socialism, to join our party and take up a fight. And if you believe that that is necessary, then you can take your place in our ranks, and we will guarantee one thing, that we will not retreat before our political responsibilities. Thank you.